It is very humbling and a real honor to be here, to be in a room with hundreds of service designery types. I don't ever think I've seen so many perfectionists in one place. It's 4 o'clock at the end of the conference. And to be a designer is really to be blessed and to be cursed with the ability to see things, to see the world how it should be, how it should work, right? Every time we walk into a public space, every time we use a website, every time we fill out a form, every time we look for the washroom, our brains are going, well, why is it like this? This is ridiculous. This could be better. But I want you all to pause and think for a second and think of an example of a perfect system. A real example in the world, anywhere in the world, a perfect system. I'm just going to give you a second to bring the image to your minds. I want to do a little thought experiment. Will you raise your hand if you thought of a natural system? A natural system. So nature is really good at making perfect systems. Do you know why? Because that project had literally millions of years to prototype and iterate. We are not that. I am not that, which bums me out every day. And what we make is not that. And I think as service designers, we sometimes forget this. We either hold ourselves to paragons of perfection that make the loved ones in our lives crazy, or just as often when we make things, we pretend that they're perfect. We pretend that they will never break. And everything we make at one point or another breaks. If you think about what a service is, at the most fundamental level, it is just the intersection and interaction between three things: customers or users, employees, and conditions. And we have things that sort of mediate between these: technology, policies, spaces. But at the end of the day, it's just this. And customers don't do what we want them to do. Employees don't do what we wish they did. And conditions don't always cooperate. And I think sometimes the tools we use tend to gloss over this fact, right? When we create personas or we create journeys, what we're doing is limiting the world to an acceptable number of behaviors, really, and conditions. I first started thinking about this problem when I started doing projects in public transit. And if any of you are here from another city, I encourage you to take the TTC, the Toronto Transit Commission, while you're here. It's actually one of the world's most integrated networks of subways, streetcars, and buses. You can catch the 14 bus right out here, and it will take you to Davisville, which is where the TTC's headquarters are. Or you can catch a shuttle to the Brickworks. The shuttle from the Brickworks to Broadview Station, and it'll get you kind of anywhere in the city. If you are from another city in North America with a transit system, chances are you will think the TTC is great. If you are from a city in Asia like Hong Kong, Tokyo, or Singapore, you will think it's not so great. But the thing about transit is it is a highly imperfect system. You are moving millions of people every day through physical space. And I can't think of another service where, regardless of your condition or situation, You are a customer, you are a user. I can't think of another service that you are encouraged to use when you are wasted. Right? Can you think of another one? And like, use it right next to somebody who's not wasted. Right? Thousands of employees, unionized environment. Many of those employees have been there for decades. They've been doing things the same way for decades. Many of them you can't literally communicate with. So when you're a bus driver, you literally go to a depot in the morning, you check in, you get on your bus, and you drive. You may never have a conversation over the course of a typical day with another employee or supervisor. And conditions, if you've ever tried to take a streetcar in an ice storm, you can't, and that's because it's canceled, right? Imperfect customers, imperfect employees, imperfect conditions. Now, transit is just an extreme example. The truth is, all services, right, by definition, are imperfect. And if you think about essentially a 2x2, where you go from easy to change to hard to change, and a simple system or a simple service to a complex service, essentially the farther you get out to that upper right-hand quadrant, the more imperfect the system, and the likely more imperfections you'll see in your service. In that lower left, right? A simple service that's easy to change. Right now, I'm sorry to say, the most perfect service in my life is Amazon Prime, right? I click 2 buttons, and the next day, something appears at my house, right? What you'll see with services in this quadrant is simple, and I don't mean it's just simple behind the scenes. It's not. But often it's boiled down to one journey or one behavior or set of behaviors, right? So Uber, right? One journey. There's really one sequence of behaviors. Airbnb, it's really one sequence of behaviors, and because they're digital products, digital services, they are easy to change. So the good news is that services like this are our most perfect services. The bad news is that they're irresistible. And they're actually services to really keep an eye on, because they tend, when they have consequences that we can't see as users, that's where it gets, honestly, really unhelpful for society, right? You think about the carbon footprint of Amazon Prime. You think about the effect on precarious employment of Uber. You think about the effect on housing of Airbnb. And yet these platforms are really hard to stay away from. You go up, right? Services that are easy to change, but very complex. And these are services that when you encounter them, they almost feel like a well-orchestrated, well-coordinated orchestra. So I'm going to talk about an example from a hospital. It happens to be a hospital in the University Health Network, which Ty works with, who spoke before. And it's Princess Margaret Hospital. It's one of the top 5 cancer centers in Canada. And I have unfortunate personal experience with it right now because I have a family member being treated for cancer. And the good news is the prognosis is amazing. But going through this service has actually changed, for me at least, what I thought was possible for a service. We have seen dozens of individual practitioners. We probably go to at least an appointment every other week, oftentimes multiple appointments a week. At each appointment, there is at least 5 touch points with different professionals. It might be check-in, a nurse, a fellow, a doctor, and then often the pharmacy. And the handoffs are actually kind of miraculous. They do a really miraculous job of both being highly efficient, but at the same time, giving us real care and attention. And I'll talk more about some of the things that appear to make that work. Now, what's something that's simple and hard to change? Well, in our lives, we know these as bureaucracies. And in some ways, they're becoming harder and harder to see in public life, largely because of people like us in this room. But if you think about the classic Department of Building Permits, right, where they essentially do one thing, right? They just issue building permits based on building codes. But the experience for citizens is often, it's a black box, it's a Kafka-esque maze, right? I can't make it through. Now, what happens when it's hard to change and complex? And that's services that feel like chaos, right? And in fact, the best example I have from my work life is the New York subway. Right, the New York subway, I had worked on transit in Toronto, and then to go to New York, it is a whole other order of magnitude, right? 472 stations, 50,000 employees, 2 billion people moved a year, right? And the thing about these services is that when they start to break down, they really start to break down. In 2017, the governor of New York pronounced a state of emergency for the New York subway. Now, I want to be very clear that this feeling of chaos is what users, what customers, what riders, what passengers, what citizens feel. Having worked inside New York City Transit, I can tell you that these people are passionate, dedicated, focused, experts who wake up every day with one mission, and it is to get millions of people from point A to B on time safely every day. But I want to talk more about what it means, what it's like for customers. Okay? What is the customer journey of an imperfection? And if you, is there some way, this is ironic. I'm gonna keep going. Okay, stop. I want to test. I want you to think about what you just felt. I want you to think about the uncertainty you just went through with me, and, right, in a way, the loss of control. And that is what customers feel every time they hit an imperfection. Right? It is this sort of downward spiral until you hit bottom, and then either because it gets resolved or you find your way out, you're boop, I'm out, right? So the first reaction was a reaction that some of you may have been feeling a few seconds ago. Yeah, you gotta be kidding me, right? It's this moment of surprise. The next, what is going on, right? I literally don't know what is happening. Who's in charge? Who can I blame? Who is responsible? Well, what happens now? Like, where do I go from here? And in fact, what am I supposed to do? Because inevitably, in these moments of imperfection, right, a customer does hit a moment where they either have to think like, well, I'm gonna ditch this line, I'm gonna abandon this cart, right? I'm gonna take some action to hotwire the service. And then they get out and they're, oh, I'm glad it's over. And in my experience, we sometimes, as service designers, overestimate the degree to which people want to carry imperfection with them and complain about it forever. Really, people are used to seeing imperfection in services. They want to get on with their day. Now, it's true that with social media, it tends to amplify voices that really are unhappy or that really want to be vocal about imperfections. What is happening on the other side of the counter right now, right? What is happening usually, and too often, when customers confront this sort of imperfection? For those of you from other cultural contexts, in Canada, crickets is a euphemism meaning silence. Oh, thank God. Oh, it's over. We made it through. We still have our jobs. What do customers want to happen? Right? The first thing they want you to do is they want you to answer before you even ask the question, right? This is what's happening and why. I am responsible, right? The person in front of you, you are talking to right now, I am responsible, but you are in charge. Remember, right, the two fundamental emotions of a customer experience imperfection, uncertainty and loss of control. Here's what you can expect, right? Even if sometimes that is like, we don't have an answer, we don't know, we will get back to you. These are your options. Again, giving control back to the customer. And thanks for understanding. Right? That little moment. How rare is that little moment, right? When you go through a service imperfection and somebody says like, that sucked, right? And it's not, sometimes we can estimate what's required in that moment. We think we have to make it right, or we have to give you something. But just this gesture can be deeply, deeply powerful. So, if that's the experience, and it's sort of a universal customer experience of imperfection, then what can we do as designers? What strategies do we have in our toolbox to help address it, to actually design for it rather than pretend it doesn't exist or pretend that we can always control it? I would say that the biggest example of an imperfect system we have going on right now in the world is climate change, right? There is no greater example I can think of imperfect people and imperfect conditions sort of butting into a perfectly good service, planet Earth. And just like climate change, there's prevention and there's mitigation. So I'm going to share just some of the things we can do. There's lots more, and I'm sure in this room we can come up with much longer lists. So detection. So I recently had my identity stolen. And before I knew that my identity had been stolen, my bank called me. It is actually quite remarkable what's happened in financial services with fraud protection, right? Where if something happens with your credit card, your bank really now is often on it and it's resolved before you even know about it. And that is an amazing example of what is actually a reasonably large imperfection in our financial services system, and actually turning it into a positive service experience. Redundancy. So what is the most common form of redundancy? I'm having an imperfect moment where I'm sweating too much, so I'm going to do this. Redundancy. Redundancy. What's the most common form of redundancy? It's actually one question. Are you sure? Right? And talked about rational override. right? It's a wonderful, slow it down, right? Are you sure this is what you want to do? In Princess Margaret Hospital, right, we might see 7 different practitioners. Every single one of them will start with the same 3 questions. What is your name? What is your birth date? And why do you think you are here? And those questions are really very powerful ways to ensure that nobody is chopping off the wrong limb, right? A lot of really foolish mistakes can be avoided with redundancy. Education and training. Let's talk about education and training. So the thing with education and training is that we, as designers, I think, we often default to it. We often immediately go to, oh, the solution to this imperfection is customers just need to be better informed. Or employees just need training. And it's particularly deceptive because the truth is, training and education are really easy to prototype, and they tend to validate well, right, in a controlled context. But in the real world, they often don't work very well, right? Or they certainly don't work as well as we often think they do, for very real reasons. So one is, nobody reads. And really, nobody's interested in reading. The farther away you get from the moment of the imperfection, right? Giving people education about that in other contexts way ahead of time, it's not a great way to change behavior, right? Training. We often don't think about, actually, first of all, think in your own lives. How often has it been that you took a piece of training that actually changed your behavior in a specific instance? But we often don't think about the real complexities of scaling training. Like, employees turn over in organizations all the time, right? When do we hit that new employee? How do we keep training refreshed? How do we keep training sort of going often enough to actually change the behavior? And so I would just caution you and just recognize that, in a way, that default bias that we sometimes have about education and training, it can be powerful. It's not that it's never useful, but it's that we sometimes over-index on it because it's an easy tool to reach for in the toolbox. Protection. What's the oldest form of protection we have? It's the money-back guarantee, right? If you are not completely satisfied, we will give you your money back. Overdraft protection, right? In financial services at your bank is one of the simplest, right? It's a solution for a very basic customer imperfection. Now, one thing that, if you think about it, has been happening more and more is companies have recognized that there's a revenue stream here, that you can actually get people to pay more for protection against their own imperfection, right? So you get things like cancellation insurance, lost baggage insurance, right? Mitigation. What are some examples of ways that we can mitigate? Transformation. If you've ever gone to Disney World or Disneyland or Euro Disney and waited online for 40 minutes, they've done a really interesting job of actually taking a moment that is a structural imperfection in a service, right? We have essentially, people have to wait. And how do we turn that into an experience, right? And you can often think about these moments where we can't, particularly when demand rises, where you can't get out of it, how do we use that time differently to reframe it? Empowerment, you see this a lot in hospitality, right? So the classic example is Ritz-Carlton Hotel. Every employee has permission to spend up to $2,000, even housekeepers, to make it right, to do whatever it takes to make the customer happy. As service designers, this is one of those things that it's actually easy to suggest to a client, but pretty hard to get clients to sign off on, right? It can be costly. You don't know how much it's going to cost beforehand. It's hard to know what the actual level of risk is. I would say you just need really strong cultural underpinnings to make this possible. Communication. Well, communication is really just going through that sequence, right? And you can see actually in transit how communication in transit has evolved in most of our lifetimes, right? It used to be that you waited for a bus or a train and you had no way of knowing what was happening. And then screens went up on platforms and they said, you're gonna wait 3 minutes or you're gonna wait 5 minutes or it's delayed. And then announcements went from, you're gonna wait 3 minutes, oh, there's a why, because of a medical emergency. And then that medical emergency became more specific. You're gonna wait 5 minutes because somebody is on the tracks and we have a medical team on the scene, right? Oh, we're doing something about it, right? It should be cleared in a few minutes. And one of the magic of integrated mobility apps is actually now you have an option to give power to a customer to say like, oh, you are delayed in this situation, here are your route options. You can switch at the next stop, you can get off here, you can consider these options. And finally, resolution. You think about losing your baggage on an airplane. It's a good example of, used to be a very, very, very common imperfection, still is reasonably common, right? But they've really made that resolution process much simpler, much easier to sort of say your baggage has been lost, and much simpler, it's very easy to get out of the airport quicker, you go home and it shows up the next day. So again, what I would just say is, think about imperfection as you design. Look for it. Look for it not as something to be designed away, because we can't always design it away, either because we have constraints, or because, honestly, it's due to factors beyond our control. But how do we solve for it? And I'll leave you with one final thought, and it's that in this room, at this conference, we have been very, very ambitious about what service design can accomplish in the world and how we want to solve the biggest structural challenges facing our society. And I wish it wasn't the case, but that is going to take a lot of time and a lot of money, and citizens can't wait. They can't wait for us to make things suck less. There's something in transit that we talk about as the death spiral, which is that as service gets worse, funding sort of moves away from transit, customers flee transit, they flee the other forms of transportation, and then transit systems die, right? So New York, thank heavens, they've just approved a $52 billion capital plan. But New York can't wait. There's still stuff we can do in the meantime. Thank you. Thanks, David.